It's just back there. I can't hear a thing. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It would be fast and over. Hey, I want to see what this is.
Because they totally take at least the shots right now.
And like microwave.
Yeah. Like, oh, let me just.
That's not the plus. Yeah, that's the plus. Like blink of an eye.
Two things right off the bat, folks. First, I'm in no discomfort. Don't be distracted, and don't be distracted by the ugliness of it. But there's a hole in my mouth where there should be a tooth now. It's finally. Too late. There is the reading next time. We'll probably finish talking about Hume today. If not, we'll certainly finish next time. And I'm going to talk briefly about Paley's essay. Paley is the famous defender of the argument from design. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but you should just read it through and see how it strikes you. Well, here's the deal. Paley's essay is written roughly 25 years after Hume's dialogues. And presumably he has in mind some kind of response, at least to Hume. He has to have known about Hume's work. So as a reply to the dialogues, just see what you make out of it. I'll tell you what you should make out of it is it's kind of weird. But why is it weird as a response? Then we will talk about this very strange short essay by Blaise Pascal. Pascal has an argument. It's a fascinating argument, very famous argument. In fact, the standard name for it, I don't remember whether they call it this in the textbook or not, but it's known as Pascal's wager. Pascal is, among other things, one of the founders of probability theory. He's a great mathematician, among other things. And he's got this argument, so I'll just tell you what sort of the framework is. He thinks that we don't have a clue as to whether God exists or not. He is himself a devout Catholic, okay? But he thinks we don't have a clue as to whether God exists or not. Nevertheless, it is rational in some sense that he offers this argument that it's overwhelmingly rational to believe in God in spite of that. Now, Pascal is hard to read, but just give your brain a workout. Try just plowing through it. It's a page and a half long. And then I will present what everybody takes to be the argument Pascal's got in there. And it's that argument that everyone extracts from it is not opaque. I mean, you can lay it out pretty cleanly. So we'll talk about that. So Paley and Pascal will come up next time. Now, this is kind of a preface as well. There's a couple of faces out there that I detect a certain amount of hostility or anger at this discussion. Who knows? They might have been thinking about their boyfriend or their girlfriend. But some people just have a reaction to this argument. It's obviously a very famous argument for the existence of God. Hume's through Philo is beating it up one side down the other, raising all kinds of objections to it. So I want to emphasize something I did say before, that the way to think about this for our purposes is that it has nothing to do with theology or whether this is an argument for God's existence. As I mentioned before, at most, what this argument shows is that the universe is the result of intelligent design. It tells you nothing about whether the designer is good or evil. Okay? It's just a question of whether you can't explain anything this complex without thinking that it has to have been put together by intelligence. It can't have resulted in any other way. So try to think of it just in that way. It's a pure argument from something about the nature of the world that we can observe to the conclusion that it has to be the result of intelligent activity. And then something I should have done back at the beginning is just to give you a kind of silly example of the kind of argument that people make all the time. They don't lay it out like this, but this is a kind of argument that people use, the argument by analogy, the general form of argument that we use all the time. And here's the illustration. Suppose that you're in the market for a used car, right? And your eye falls on some car that's got a for sale sign in the window, and it's in terms of its looks and your preferences among manufacturers or whatever, it's just the kind of thing you're looking for. I mean, there are various things you might have looked at, but this one is right in the favorite group. So here's this car. This is car X, and you're going to think about making an offer on this thing. But first, you haven't done your homework yet, so you can do your homework and figure out whether this is really a car that you ought to be considering seriously, because you're interested in a couple of things. One is how efficient the car is, does it get reasonable mileage, whatever. And secondly, how reliable is it? Is it likely to be in the shop half the time? So what you do if you're a real nuts and bolts consumer, you go and compare it to cars like X, and that probably means going to Consumer Reports, and maybe there are other ones out there. I'm not advertising Consumer Reports either. That you get information about cars like this, about their reliability and efficiency. So you find out, suppose you find out that in general they're reliable and they're efficient. And you conclude from that probably, probably this particular car is reliable and efficient. That's exactly the kind of reasoning that's going on in the argument from design. Instead of talking about this car, we're talking about the universe. And one of the things that happens is that, of course, fly lots of planes, we don't have other universes to compare it to. So instead of comparing it to other universes, we compare it with human machinery, human artifacts, okay? Other things that are relevantly like it, right? And we make the argument from where they came from to probably where the universe came from. Now, part of the reason for putting this up here is, A, just to point out that it's a very common form of argument, but secondly, that to emphasize what the basis of the argument in the case of the universe is. If you, let me just, I'm not going to do any of that other stuff. We've got artifact, well, like this. We've got artifacts over here, and they're the result of design, and so we get probably design over here. Come back to the car example and think about this, right? You want to check out cars that are like this one so you can figure out the chances that it's going to be reliable and efficient. Cars like it, how? Well, if you look in Consumer Reports, you're not going to find out, you're not going to find information about, let's say the car you want is black. You're not going to find a category of black cars that they have got information about. You're not going to find information about cars that have leather upholstery. Yeah, there's a whole list of characteristics, right? It would be meaningless to collect information about how reliable black cars are or cars with leather upholstery and the like. So what you get comparisons with is cars that are made by the same manufacturer in the same year, they're the same model, they have the same kind of transmission. I'm not sure how far Consumer Reports breaks it down, but the comparison is with cars as similar as possible to this one, including the similarity in the actual machinery of the car, right? That is automatic, or not that there aren't anything but automatic transmissions anymore, but they used to be, all right? You get information about engine size, etc. So, in the case of the universe, in the case of the argument for design, the question is, what is the basis of the comparison between the universe and the human artifacts, houses and whatever else you want to throw in there, computers, whatever, that are the basis for the argument for design? And the answer is that there's just one. There's just one feature of the universe that is singled out as the basis for making an argument. Sorry about this, but here we go again with the gum. Right, you look at the universe, and this is what Paley zeroes in on, and we've been talking about all along, the staggering complexity of stuff in nature, right? That is taken to be the basis for being able to argue that the universe has to have been designed. So you compare it, presumably, to the most complex artifacts you can find, and you make the argument that probably the universe was designed just as the artifacts were. Okay? Okay, so you'll see why in a minute. I wanted to re-emphasize that. I screwed up last time, sorry to say, by omitting something. At the end of the class, we were talking about, I was talking about Philo's claim that there are two ways we have of garnering information about the world, namely by reason and by experience, right? So we can think about the world, we can reason about stuff, and we can also gather information just by experiencing the world. And so what he says, that this is just repeating what I said last time, that reason isn't going to tell you anything about the ultimate source of order or complexity in the universe. What it will tell you is that both mental things, right, and physical things, mind and matter, both of them require explanations. Each one requires explanation as much as any other. Why? How? What's the explanation of why this mind is here? What's the explanation of why this whale is here? The existence of anything in either category, reason tells you, has to have an explanation. That's the principle of sufficient reason, which I also mentioned last time. And then experience tells you that both minds and matters are affected by, things cause effects in both mental and physical things. So your mind is affected by all kinds of different factors, including psychological factors, but also drugs, food, weather, whatever. And the same is true of your body. It's subject to an enormous variety of causes. So we got these two kinds of things, minds and physical objects. Both of them, all kinds of things act on them, affect them in various ways, and both of them require explanation equally, right? So the idea is that you get a symmetrical relationship here, right? Whichever side you're thinking about, the mind or the matter, there isn't, for purposes of this argument, any relevant difference between them. You've got to be able to explain both of them, and both of them are affected by all kinds of things. What I left out was that Philo adds that in both of these categories, and here he's disputing Cleanthes. He doesn't say so, but he is. Both things in both of these categories, some of them exhibit self-order. That is, things in both the mental and the material world just get themselves organized somehow. Cleanthes' example, which Philo's happy enough with, is thoughts in the mind of a person, right? We actually have, some of us more than others, coherent chains of thought, right? But there isn't a kind of orderliness to anybody's, to long stretches anyway, of anybody's sort of mental activity. They're thinking about something and then mulling it over and it reminds them of something else and blah, blah, blah. So you have this something other than just random flashes of stuff in people's minds. So, okay, so ideas order themselves. They just get into a kind of coherent shape. But also, Philo points out that in what he calls generation and vegetation, these are, by generation, what he's got in mind is sexual reproduction, okay? Animals generate more animals. Vegetation is also reproduction, but it's non-sexual. It's vegetable, plant reproduction, right? So, I mean, there can be sex involved, but not necessarily. So you've got these two processes by which plants and animals come into existence, right? And you remember Cleanthes was saying, look, matter just doesn't organize itself. You throw a bunch of boards and a bunch of nails on the corner lot, don't expect to come out the next day and find out that they've organized themselves into a chicken coop or something, right? They're just going to be sitting there. The matter doesn't organize itself. And what Philo's saying here is, well, not all matter organizes itself, but lots of it does. You stick a seed in the ground, and with any kind of luck, a few months later you'll have tomatoes. And that plant is just sitting there, just being its own physical thing, growing into a complex and organized thing. So the idea is, look, ordering, self-ordering, both mind and matter are self-ordering. So there's the full picture, okay, that Philo wants to claim that on both sides of the fence you have the same situation, okay? Both kinds of things need an explanation. Both kinds of things are capable of organizing themselves, and both things are affected by all kinds of things in their environments. So this is part of Philo's attempt to make a certain point, a crucial point against Cleanthes. Namely, that what he wants to say is that Cleanthes hasn't really given us an explanation. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it is. Cleanthes' explanation is the God has explained the universe. And all of this stuff that I've just been reviewing is part of Philo's making the case that, look, this isn't really an explanation. It's not a solution, an answer to the question that Cleanthes was originally posing. Namely, how do you explain the existence of this complex thing? And you remember I said last time that Cleanthes, in response, makes a legitimate point. Right? What he says is, look, what you want me to do is you want me to explain where God came from. I don't have to do that. My problem was to explain where the universe came from, and I just did. I explained to you it comes from God. It's designed by God. Right? And it's just not true that I have to go on and on and on explaining things in order to have a real explanation here. And my example was the car, right? The accident that's caused by defective brake linings. That's a perfectly good explanation without explaining why the brake linings were defective. Okay? Yeah? Oh, definitely not. The idea is this is a non-physical being, spiritual being. Right. Now, what's true here is that what's actually going on is that there are two separate questions that are being kind of smudged together here. It's okay for, and it's okay for Cleanthes to say, look, this is an explanation. This is my explanation. And I can't explain to you where God came from. Cleanthes may think he's always been there. He never came from anywhere. What Philo's trying to argue here is, look, Cleanthes, actually, what you were trying to do was to explain, it's true, where the universe came from. But your argument is based on the idea that anything as complex as the universe has to have been designed. Okay? That's crucial to your argument, right? There's no other way to explain how anything that complex could come into existence except by being designed. Now, you may have in some sense explained where the universe came from, but you haven't explained how there could possibly be anything that complex, because this God that you argued for up here, the mind of God, that actually the God who created this universe, has to be at least as complex as the universe. So you have this, you can even think of it as a virtually infinitely complex mind that has the capacity to design a universe. So what you've really done is you've said this. You said there's this very complicated thing in this complex thing. And my explanation of how it came into existence is from this thing. But this thing that you've postulated as your explanation is at least as complex as the thing you started with. And according to you yourself, anything this complex must have an explanation. In fact, it has to have been designed. The only way anything that complex could come into existence is by design. Yeah?
I guess I don't understand why they're even bringing this up, because at the beginning of the whole conversation, didn't they both agree that one of the things that's just true for the argument is that God exists?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But
So then why couldn't they say that God created the universe? Like, why are they trying to explain something they already said is true?
Nice question. It's not unrelated to what I said about the angry faces I saw out there earlier. The question whether God exists is one thing. The question whether this argument gives you any reason to believe that is an entirely different matter. Okay? The question, this whole project that they're engaged in is a dispute about whether or not the complexity of the universe is itself a reason to believe that God exists. It could be that he created the universe, but could a universe like this have come into existence without him? Or would anything this complex have to have been created by a mind? So that's what this is about. And I don't know if you remember, but what I said about, Philo is actually he's actually making fun of Demea in that beginning, where he says, of course I agree that God exists. I mean, something caused the universe, and whatever it is, we just call it God. So by definition, God exists, right? I mean, that's a way of saying, it's just a way of having fun, right? Hume pretty clearly didn't think God existed, but that's neither here nor there either, right? The only question here is whether this is a good argument for it, right? Back there first, yeah.
So, really, with the whole complexity justification for God and the universe must having to be at least as equally complex, he sort of backs himself into a corner.
Cleanthes?
Yeah, where God can't really be the end-all be-all to have created the universe. If he is at least as complex, he had to have been designed. So he sort of backs himself into a corner where he doesn't want to be.
Yeah, I mean that's what Philo's objecting to now. He's saying to Cleanthes, look, the question wasn't your own question wasn't just how to explain this. I mean, well, your objective was to explain how this came into existence. But part of your argument for why it has to have been designed is that anything as complex as this must have been designed. So by your own argument, you have to admit that God was designed, right? And the point is, obviously, Cleanthes doesn't want to accept that, right? Even if whatever he may think about God, he certainly doesn't think that somebody designed and created God. Yeah. So just to say again, what the two things are here that you can think of Cleanthes is trying to do. One is just to explain where the universe came from, right? Lots of people have tried to do that. Lots of ancient cultures had all kinds of stories about how the universe came into existence, and you can have different stories about that, right? But what's really going on in the design argument, of course, is to say that to give an argument for why it has to be a certain kind of story about how the universe came into existence, namely that it was designed. And the claim is, Philo's being fair about this, that Cleanthes is arguing that anything with this kind of massive complexity couldn't have come into existence except by design. And so Philo's saying, look, you said this complicated thing came from this complicated thing, but according to you, all complicated things have to have been designed, so this one must have been too, right? So, while it's okay for Cleanthes to say that you can explain the existence of the universe in terms of God, and that it's a perfectly good explanation, you haven't answered the question, right, where complexity comes from, right? The idea that anything beyond a certain level of complexity can only be explained by design gets you into this jam, right? Yeah.
Okay, I thought all three philosophers were naturalists, right?
I'm not sure what you mean by you mean a natural theologian, the guys who think that that's true to Cleanthes and Philo.
Okay.
To me, is a odd man out. Yeah.
Okay, but wouldn't the explanation of God and his complexity be that he explains himself, he creates himself, he is his own?
These guys aren't into, because they're naturalists, maybe they're not into the idea of self-creation, right? Something that explains itself. And I mean, you're right. I mean, there's another tradition back in the cosmological tradition. People do argue that, right? But not with these guys, right? Okay, so yeah, I guess I've said this about 3 times, so I won't say it again, right? But there are these 2 different things that you could be thinking about, and Philo is zeroing in on the infinite regress problem. Anything that's complicated has to be explained. So it just sort of comes to an end. Yeah, let me just stop there. And in part 5, you get a takeoff on a new angle in which Philo argues that Cleanthes has got a problem with his whole way of arguing for the existence of God. Namely, that he's going to wind up where Demea accuses Cleanthes of winding up, of thinking of God basically as a glorified human being, right? Remember, Demea accused Cleanthes of being an anthropomorphist, right? This has an idea of God modeled on what a human being is. So here's how that argument goes. Philo starts out saying, look, similar effects usually have similar causes. Windows break, those are similar effects. They're usually the result of things hitting them too hard, heavy enough objects hitting them too hard, whatever. Similar effects usually have at least similar causes. Not all the time, but usually. So, the bigger the difference between natural things and things in nature and human artifacts or machinery, the greater the difference is likely to be between the sources of those things, the things that made them happen, so to speak, brought them into existence, right? Similar effects have similar causes. Dissimilar effects likely to have dissimilar causes. So if human artifacts and Mother Nature are really very, very different, then they're likely to have different kinds of explanations of their existence. And Cleanthes says, yeah, that's true, but the more we learn about nature, the more obvious it is that what you're looking at is the work of a mind. Yeah, this doesn't really require any argument. Cleanthes thinks you can just see. You see anything this complicated, you just know this is the product of a mind. And so Philo says, you mean a mind like a human mind? And Cleanthes says, well, what other kind of mind you got in mind? Of course. I mean, it's the only kind of minds we know anything about. Yes, I'm talking about like a human mind. And so Philo says, and for purposes of your argument, the more similar the minds are. I missed it. Sorry. Glad you all had a good laugh. The more similar these two minds are, the better for your argument, right? So Philo is trying to get Cleanthes to just say, you know, this really, really, really is a tight relationship here, and therefore these things really are, the corresponding minds really are very, very similar. At which point, Philo pounces. And he says, well, in the first place, notice that then this part of it, you know, the theology does come in here to this part of the argument, pretty obviously. Philo says, look, in that case, you have no basis whatever in comparing in your study of the world and what the work of the mind that you find in the world to conclude that the mind is infinite. Right? There's nothing about it. Mother Nature is finite. Why would you require infinity? Right? So you don't have to have an infinite intellect or an infinite anything else in the designer of the universe. It's got to be very impressive, obviously, but infinity is another wild thing, as we saw already. So, and in fact, he says, even once you see that you don't have a basis for infinity, but nevertheless, suppose you have a very, very impressive mind that has to be behind the universe if it's designed. You have no basis on which to conclude that this universe that you and I are familiar with is a particularly good example of what a finite, powerful being would create. I mean, just think about practical matters. I mean, could you think of ways to improve this universe? Would the world be better if certain things weren't true of it? Could you imagine that there are other worlds like this, excuse me, that are better than this world is? Sorry. So the idea is that, right, you're not going to get a very godlike creature if you are trying to arrive at the conclusion about what the designer of the universe is like on the basis of what we can actually observe in the finite, limited world. Furthermore, the fellow says, there's no basis that I can see in how you're thinking here for concluding that the universe is the actual product of the architect, the person you're thinking of as having thought up the designs for the universe, right? The architect may have lots and lots of different beings working for it, right? It's not, you don't have to have, this is, as you may notice, the problem that Aquinas ran into in the teleological argument, where there had to be a mind outside nature, and there's no reason it has to be one as opposed to whatever number you want. So Philo's making the same point here, that you might have division of labor among various designers, and you might even have a process of trial and error. I mean, the first cars ever to come off the assembly line weren't the best cars ever to come off the assembly line. They kept getting better and better, and so maybe this is one of the early models, right? It's not all that great, right? I mean, this goes on and on. And he points out that, furthermore, if you're really modeling this on human artifacts now, right? This is the model that we're using. These minds are supposed to be very much alike and therefore operating similarly. It also leaves open the possibility that you have generations of these beings, right? There's no reason to think they're immortal. They may be, we may be in the 117th generation of world makers. Finally, Philo just says, so why don't you just agree with what Demetrius said earlier, right? Your idea of God is anthropomorphic. It's just very much like a human being, and that's because, like, right, the comparison you're drawing, these things really are all that similar, so they have extremely similar origins. Then get serious, right? Here's what the origins of human machinery are like, and then he goes through this whole list of stuff. And so, the way to sort of put this in a sentence, the point that Philo's making here is that the stronger the argument is, the stronger the design argument is, the stronger this similarity is, and right, the more the argument pushes you to the idea that Cleanthes doesn't want, right? It doesn't get you to the God that Cleanthes is thinking about, right? What it pushes you to is that the origins of both sets of very similar things are very similar in all these respects, right? So there's a kind of charge that the argument's self-defeating, right? By trying to show that the universe must have been designed in very much like the way in which Chevrolets are designed and manufactured. What you're doing is turning the designer and manufacturer. You're presenting an argument for why the designer and manufacturer is not anything much like the God that Cleanthes is trying to argue for. Okay, so that's all that happens in part 5. At which point, Demetrius just throws in one of his things. He says, well, why would anybody worship something like that? And of course, the whole point is that you wouldn't, right? Then in the next part, you get something quite different and also quite interesting, once again, Philo kicks it off, and he says, here's another general idea, that if two things share a bunch of features, they're similar in certain ways, they're probably similar in other interesting ways. And the universe, it strikes me, has a certain similarity to an animal body, right? In the sense that there are processes there's regular processes that repeat themselves. There is the similarity in things coming into existence and going out of existence, parts of the body coming into existence, going out of existence, by which he means the ingestion of food and then the elimination of waste products and the like. There's certain, at a pretty abstract level, there are certain similarities between the universe and an animal. So here's an argument. Maybe we should think of the universe, instead of having this anthropomorphic picture of God, what we should do is think of the universe itself as a kind of animal in a way, right? It's this thing that it's internally stable, and it has these processes that go on in it. And God is the soul of the universe, right? So the universe is God's body, right? Is what Philo's suggesting here. It sounds, I'm sure, pretty wild, but there it is. And Philo points out that, to his natural theologian colleague here, that one thing that experience does tell us is that minds only occur in embodied form. The only minds that anybody has any contact with are the minds of other people. They're people's minds. So the mind is embodied in a physical entity. Those of you who think you can communicate with ghosts probably want to disagree with that, but these guys think the only minds we have any contact with are embodied. And Cleanthes doesn't dispute that. So Cleanthes just says, yeah, I can see, this kind of stretched analogy maybe between the universe and an animal, and thinking of God. That, yeah, I never thought of that. That's a possibility. And then Cleanthes says, well, there are some pretty serious dissimilarities too. I mean, for example, the universe doesn't have any eyes or ears. I mean, it doesn't have any sense organs at all, right? I mean, that's one thing about animals. They all have some kind of sense organs. The universe doesn't have any sense organs, and it doesn't seem to have a brain. I mean, there's no center to the universe that's sort of in charge of the rest of the universe, right? No operating system set into some central bit. And so I'm more tempted, Cleanthes says, by the idea that the universe is like a plant than it is like an animal, for just these reasons, right? Plants don't have sense organs, they don't have brains, but they're complex, and so Cleanthes tries to give this, make out the suggestion that there's a certain kind of similarity, again, at some very abstract level, between the universe as a whole and these particular kinds of things in it, plants, which get called vegetables in 18th century English. And then there's this kind of interesting sidebar, which I'm going to mention because of what it leads to, leads Philo to say. Cleanthes says, look, on your picture of the universe, namely that it is an animal, right? And that God is the mind of the universe is his body. You seem this seems to imply that the universe is eternal. Actually, this seems to me to apply just as well to Cleanthes, but never mind that. Just here's what Cleanthes' objection is. If the universe is God's body, and then you see that seems to imply that the universe is eternal, right? And that is pretty hard to swallow, given certain obvious facts. And he mentions that there's some plants and animals, European plants and animals, that only arrived in the Americas within the previous 200-300 years. Okay, and Cleanthes says, here comes infinity again, right? If the universe is infinitely old, those plants would have gotten to the Americas infinitely long ago. In fact, there would have been maybe infinite number of generations getting to America. It sure as hell wouldn't have just happened in the last 300 years, right? You know, that just seems, those two seem incompatible. In fact, the only way, Cleanthes says, it seems to me you can make any sense out of the idea that the plants only got there a finite short time ago. If the universe is infinitely old, is you have to imagine that the universe just sort of self-destructs every once in a while, then it starts up again. And so, you know, we're just living in the latest reincarnation of the universe, and so that's why the plants just got there 300 years ago. But that requires this crazy idea that the universe just comes into existence and self-destructs, self-creates and self-destructs over and over again. Hang on just one second. The response that Philo makes to this is to say to Cleanthes, well, how do you know that's not exactly what happened? Right? That the universe does, in fact, just, it begins and it crashes, and it begins over again and it crashes again. And so Philo throws out, this is one of the few places where you see Philo actually positively suggesting something that's pretty clearly Hume's thought. Hume's idea is, and Philo's, that, you know, if I had to adopt some theory about the history of the universe, and he's not saying there's any reason to believe this, but because he doesn't think we have any way of figuring that out. But if I had to adopt a theory, that's exactly what it would be. I would think the universe, it comes into existence, the matter gets itself organized, and this goes on for a very long time, but eventually it all collapses, and then it starts over again. That would be my hypothesis. I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying that's what I think. But in any case, it's not an incoherent hypothesis, and so you get this little exchange. And as I say, the reason for going through it is just to point out that this is actually Hume tossing out this slight preference, if he had to choose a theory about the history of the universe, it's just this cyclical thing that just keeps on going. Yeah.
So does he suggest that when it starts over, even if it starts over exactly as it was in its previous existence, being an identical universe?
No. I mean, there's nothing, it's a very brief couple of comments that he makes. It's just the idea of, the way to think of it is just a collapse and a rebirth. And one cycle of the universe could be as different as you want from a previous one. Yeah?
Is there anything that suggests the same designer of the previous universe?
We're not talking about a designer at all here. Right? This is just a hypothesis that the universe, that it's a response to Cleanthes. Back up. Right, so Philo's idea is that the universe is like an animal. God is the mind, and the universe is his body. Right? So Cleanthes' objection to this is that since the universe is God's body, it's got to be eternal, and therefore infinite, had been here for an infinitely long time. And he says, that's a problem for you, Philo, because if it's been here a long time, why the hell did those plants just get to America in the last 300 years? There's been an infinite time. They should have been there an infinite time ago. And so that's how this all comes up. So you're thinking about this hypothesis that the universe isn't created by God. It's God's body, and therefore it is infinitely old. It's just always been here. God is the mind, and the universe is the body. And so it's just this little wrinkle here that Cleanthes brings up. If it's infinitely old, how come anything can be happening just recently for the first time? That's crazy, right, if it's infinitely old. And so he's the one who brings up the possibility. The only way I can understand that is if the universe kept crashing and then it would come back into existence. At that point, Philo says, well, that's what I would actually go for. Right? He's the one that made the suggestion that the universe is like an animal, and you just let God be its mind. But at the end here, what he's saying, he's just stripping away all of that. He's just saying, look, if you wanted me to tell you just where I would opt if I just had to take a shot in the dark about what the history of the universe is, it just would be this infinitely old thing, which just, minus the God now as the mind, that just creates itself, comes into existence and self-destructs over and over and over again. And so, it's a finite time ago was the last time it came into existence, and here we are in the middle of it, and that's why new things keep happening, because it's just a finite time. Was there a hand out of my corner of my eye? No. Oh, over here, sorry. I'm sorry, as a result of what? Procreation. Oh, sure. That is, you mean a couple of universes getting together and having another universe? Is that what you were talking about? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, it's coming up in the very next dialogue. That comes up. Okay, so at the very beginning of the next part, Philo says, look, given what we've just been talking about, these analogies to between the universe and either animals or plants, this is what occurs to me. Obviously, and of course, this is what it was all leading up to in Hume's mind. He set it up this way. If the universe resembles either plants or animals more than it does houses and Chevrolets, right, then you're going to get yourself a very different argument. Namely, that the universe probably came into existence by a process something like the process by which plants and animals come into existence. So you're getting, this is an objection that's the opposite of the one we just saw a bit back, where Philo was saying, look, Cleanthes, if your argument's actually any good, if this really is a tight comparison of complexity, meaning that there's a tight similarity between the origins of these things, then what you're doing is turning God into a glorified human being. You're not going to get the God you think you're arguing for, or that you are arguing for, or trying to argue for. So one way to put that is, if this comparison is really, really good, then you're not going to get the conclusion that Cleanthes wants. Now what Philo does is to suggest that the basis of this argument, the comparison of the universe with human artifacts, is actually, he doesn't put it this way, but it actually violates its own guiding light. Right? So let me put it in those terms, and I'll go back here. Remember that and this is why I did what I did at the very beginning of this class, to emphasize that the basis of this argument is the complexity of the universe. If you are a natural theologian, and if you are going to make an argument about the universe's origin, based on its complexity, and you're going to use this kind of an argument, where you're drawing an analogy, you're looking for similar things, then by your own logic, the way you're thinking about this, you've got to compare it to the most complex things you can find. And what this part is aimed at trying to show is that the argument ignores the most important, most relevant evidence there is. Namely, it ignores plants and animals, which are a hell of a lot more complex than houses and computers or Chevrolets. So the argument now is you've got these two. You can say that you've got three categories of stuff out here. Just to keep it as simple as it is here. There are three categories of complex things in the universe. One of them, the ones we were talking about all along, are the human artifacts. But these two are much, much more complex than these. So if you're going to compare, if you're going to try to figure out where the universe probably came from, based on the single fact that it's extremely complex, then you need to compare it with the most complex things you can find and see where they came from, right? So plants come from other plants, and animals come from other plants, and so you get what Hume calls this process of vegetation, right, by which plants produce plants, and the process of generation by which animals produce animals. And the argument is going to lead you to conclude that probably the universe came into existence by one of these processes, the way animals and plants are produced, than the way Chevrolets are produced. Okay? Why? Because of the nature of the argument. The nature of the argument is that complexity is the key to trying to figure out the origin of the universe. Right? So if you're going to do this kind of comparison with other complex things, you've got to zero in on the seriously complex things. I mean, the fact is human machinery isn't actually seriously complex by comparison with plants and animals. So now the other argument, the earlier argument about the anthropomorphism was, if this argument is really a good argument, there's a really tight comparison between the universe and human artifacts, then you're going to be driven to the wrong conclusion, the one Cleanthes doesn't want, an anthropomorphic God. Now, the claim is that not only is it not extremely tight, right, the basis of the argument is actually it's defective because it leaves out of account the most relevant, by its own logic, the most relevant comparison. It doesn't look at the most complex things that are out there. Okay. So you get these pictures about how this vegetation or generation process might happen, and Demea is going nuts, of course, at this point. I mean, so Philo says, hey, this is not so hard to understand. What he calls the great vegetable produces seeds, and the seeds just drift off, and whatever the conditions are, they turn into new universes. And it suggests that, and partly this is just humorous, obviously, but a comet might be a sperm just drifting around looking for the right ovum to hook up with and produce another new universe, right? This is just to let Demea back in here again and say, but then Demea says, look, this is just fantasy stuff. This is insanity. This is crazy stuff. There's no reason to take any of this seriously. To which Philo responds, you're absolutely right, Demea. There's no reason to take any of it seriously. This is a crazy process, this whole argument. We don't have a clue. We don't have any evidence to support any of these theories, but they're all out there. And what we're trying to do here, Demea, not with much help from you, is to just think about the inner workings of this argument. What exactly is the argument? And at the moment, the point is that the argument ignores the relevant evidence. So, yeah, this is as good a place as any to bring a kind of a sidebar. This is not in Hume, but there's a very famous paleontologist named Jay Gould. Maybe some of you heard of him. Just died a few years ago at the ripe old age of 60 at Harvard. He wrote lots and lots of semi-popular stuff, and he talked about the design argument a couple of times, and he made this suggestion, right? I should say that Gould's own religious views are fairly hard to pin down. I mean, he had a religious streak in him. So this is not just some raging atheist screaming about the argument from design. But on the other hand, he pretty clearly didn't believe the sort of standard story about the creation. In any case, he had this, so he didn't think that this argument was a good argument. But he made this proposal. to people who are going, if you're going to get into an argument, and he's thinking, if you're on my side, right, and you think this argument's no good, and you're going to get into a debate with somebody, don't use as an example of a thing out there in nature that you want to compare the universe to a gull's wing, a seagull's wing. Okay, this is the particular thing he picked out. What's wrong with picking a gull's wing as something to compare the universe to? And his answer is because a gull's wing is exactly what a essentially omnipotent creator would provide for a bird that it wanted to be able to fly well. I mean, no engineer could possibly improve on the design of a gull's wing. It's just perfection. Right? So you don't want to get that kind of example in there, right? Because it's going to tilt the argument in favor of folks who think that the universe is designed. And instead, you said what you want to do is pick some of these weird things that happen in nature that suggest, it's kind of crazy to think that somebody actually designed this from scratch this way. And the easiest example to describe to you is actually a fascinating, biologically and historically fascinating example. Namely, whales' teeth. You may think that whales don't have teeth, and you're right. But here's what's true about whales. When they are still in the womb, they grow an entire set of teeth, right? Full set of teeth. And then before they are born, the teeth dissolve. And what they grow is a set of what's called baleen, this radiator-like looking set of slats that it strains gazillions of gallons of water through. Whales actually eat the smallest things in the ocean practically, and they strain them through the baleen. So Gould's point is, here's an example where at least, right, it's not just obvious that if you were going to create a whale, you would create this creature that grows a whole set of teeth in the womb and then dissolves them all away before it's born. Why would you throw that in, right? And so here's the reason for bringing that up. That Hume doesn't care what objects you choose in nature to, he'd be perfectly happy to talk about the gull's wing, right? Perfectly happy to talk about the whale as well. But the structure of the argument is what you can see in this last argument here, where the insistence is that we compare the universe to plants and animals, right? And what you find when you look out there in nature, and you can say this to Professor Gould, look, where does a gull's wing come from? Well, along with the entire rest of the gull, it comes from its parents. It's generated sexually. The parents, in some sense, create the gull's wing, right? It doesn't come off the assembly line. It isn't manufactured somewhere. It comes into existence by a natural process, right? So, perfect or imperfect, apparently beautifully designed oddity of nature, it doesn't matter, right? What the natural theologian needs to do, right, looking out there in nature, is to just ask the question, like, where do designed things come from? Right? Or sorry, where do complex things come from? And it turns out, now the argument is here, some of them are designed. Human beings design and manufacture them. Some of them come into existence by a process of vegetation, plants reproducing. Some come into existence by a process of generation, by sexual generation. Right? Other things come into existence by instinct. There are some spectacular things out there in Mother Nature that are just the products of instinct. Spider webs are pretty neat things, but there are much more complicated things than that out there that are just being done by instinct. So, you come to one of the nubs now of the argument, and this is where things can get a little bit this is the one place where I'm never convinced that I can get this across clearly enough, right? We're back to the, in a way, back to the point where Hume is complaining, look, you haven't explained where order comes from if you explain where the universe comes from in terms of God, because God is also complex, etc., etc., etc. So right, complexity itself is not explained. You can explain the universe in terms of God, right? Philo should grant that to Cleanthes, right? This may in fact be the actual origin of the universe. It may have been created by God. But in explaining where the universe came from, just be clear that you have not explained where complexity comes from, right? How complexity can come into existence, right? Because according to you, anything as complex as the universe, including God's mind, has to have been designed, right? It's the only way it could come into existence. So you haven't answered that question. See, these are two quite different questions, okay? So it's if you think now about the difference between imagine an argument going on contemporaneously about this issue, and somebody says, as I just did, look, one of the more beautifully complex things in the world is a seagull, including its wing. Where do seagulls come from? They come from other seagulls. They're not designed. The immediate response to that, the obvious response to that is, well, where the hell did those seagulls come from? Right? I mean, yeah, you can tell me this seagull came from those seagulls. I get that. But what I want to know is, where do seagulls come from? Right? So it's, it's like pushing Cleanthes, right? Where did this complex thing come from? Right? And there is nothing wrong with that question. There's nothing wrong with asking where the seagulls came from. But what you do have to do is just as you have to recognize that Cleanthes may have given a perfectly good explanation here, and human designers, right, may be the explanation. They're perfectly good explanations for where the artifacts came from. But just as when I say, that this magnificent seagull came into existence by a process of sexual generation, right? What brought it into existence was its parents and their sexual activities, right, and produced the next generation of a seagull. And somebody wants to say, yeah, well, where did those seagulls come from? That's a very natural question. What's not so natural, and this is part of why I think it's hard for people to wrap their minds around the whole story about the design argument. It's not so natural here. The argument would never have gotten off the ground if it were natural. If I say, okay, you've got a complicated thing there, it's a Cray computer, right? And I admit that's a very complex thing, which I don't begin to understand. And I grant you, it came into existence by design and creation, right? But what I want to know is, where did the designers come from? You haven't explained to me where as complex a thing as a Cray computer can come into existence, if all you've told me is that it came into existence by the effort of this even more complicated thing, namely this human being or this team of human beings or whatever. Where did they come from? Okay, so that's a perfectly good question. Depends on what question you're trying to answer. But this is where the crux of the problem about the design argument comes, and that Cleanthes has to face up to. That the really important question for the design argument is, the problem is that it purports to be an explanation of how anything as complex as the universe could come into existence. And the argument is that it has to be by design. When you then point out that, right, when you then point out that in the same sense in which designers, I should call these designers now, designers explain the existence of artifacts, plants explain the existence of plants, and animals explain the existence of plants. That in the same sense, meaning they're the ones that bring them into existence. And of course, you can always ask where any of these things came from. According to the design argument, you have to be able to explain the existence of anything as complex as this. Therefore, you have to be able to explain the existence of anything as complex as these, because these are even more complex. But then, so are all of these. The other animals, the plants, and the designers are all extremely complex things, and so you have to have an explanation of them. And if Cleanthes eventually says, yes, well, it all had to come from God, right? God is the explanation of all these things. Right? You just introduced yet another extremely complex thing, and according to the design argument, anything that complex has to have been designed. And so God has to have been designed. I don't see how the design argument can avoid, I don't know anyway that the design argument can avoid being stuck with that result. It's easy to get lost in the meantime, especially on this point, right? I only just mention it again because it's such an interesting split, right? If you're trying to argue that, look, complex things come into existence by other processes that have nothing to do with design and don't involve intelligence at all, like sex and vegetation, it's natural to say, yeah, but where'd the things that had the sex and were doing the vegetating, where'd they come from? Whereas when you say the house or the computer or the Chevrolet or whatever, I know how it came into existence. It was designed. You don't just instantly say, yeah, but where'd they come from? Because it's a satisfying answer, right? You're not getting exactly the same kind of thing. But for purposes of the argument, you are. You're getting another complex thing, which therefore has to have been designed. Yeah.
They usually like cars and like technology examples, but like they have like different designers and different parts of the car per se. So with that compared to like different designers of the universe, that would be supported by God.
Try raising your voice. Try being calm quiet just for a minute here. Let me see if I can get this right. Yeah.
So you said that there's designers for a car, but there are different designers for different parts of the car. So if you take that to God and the universe, does that mean that there's more than one like God and like that?
No, that's yeah. I was trying to make that point. Maybe I didn't make it very clearly in the previous thing, where we're looking at the other argument where Philo was saying, look, if your argument's actually got a strong base here, if these things really are similar, the universe and human artifacts, you're going to wind up thinking that there's a whole lot of designers out there, right? Or you're not going to get the being that you want. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, folks, we made it. Actually, we didn't quite, almost. So we'll do Paley and Pascal next time. And also, I'm going to give you your study questions for the first exam. So don't forget to come back.